Hello, and welcome back to Sociology of Law. In week 3, we're going to finish up our discussion of case structure and how that affects the handling of legal cases. And today's topic is relational distance. So last week, we mostly focused on what you could call the vertical structure of a conflict, meaning the patterns of social status involved, including the social elevation of the case, as known by the overall status of both parties. And we talked about the effect of social stratification, also called vertical distance, how much inequality there is between the parties, whether they're rich and poor or respected and disrespected. And we talked about vertical direction, whether the case is upward or downward, whether it's a rich person suing a poor person or a poor person suing a rich person, and so forth. And so this is the vertical aspect of the social world, the arrangement of people into different strata of upper class and lower class, more powerful and less powerful. But of course, inequality is not the whole story of human society. There's more than just vertical structure in human relationships. There's also horizontal structure, and this refers to the patterns of social ties between people, what links people together, and how social networks are patterned. And so, under the topic of horizontal structure, we can consider things like the distribution of intimacy, the distribution of interdependence between people, and their degree of cultural similarity or differences from one another. And horizontal structure also has effects on the handling of legal cases. Consider, in this section, a major part of the horizontal structure of human relationships. The concept here is relational distance, which is a sociological conception of intimacy. So intimacy you might think of in psychological terms as a feeling of closeness people have for each other, but here we're defining it behaviorally by the degree of participation people have in one another's lives. So you can measure relational distance by things like the frequency and scope of interaction between people and the length of their relationship. People who interact a lot and have known each other a long time, and their interactions cover many domains of life, including private affairs and living together and stuff like that. They're very relationally close. And people who don't interact very often or haven't known each other very long, or their interactions are very limited in scope, like, buying cigarettes from the same 7-Eleven clerk every week, that is a relationship that's more relationally distant. So we could rank different kinds of relationships and how relationally close or distant they tend to be. Close relationships would include things like relationships between spouses or close family, like the nuclear family, people who grow up and live together, and best friends, the people you talk to the most often and share the most of your life with. Moving out from there, more distant relationships would be things we might call casual acquaintances, like people who see each other now and again, but not very frequently, or the relationship doesn't go back very far. Maybe classmates, people who know each other from a class at college, but you wouldn't really call them friends. They don't really see each other outside of that one setting. Maybe distant family too, you could put in here, like that cousin you've seen at family reunions every 10 years, but you don't really talk to them otherwise. And still more distant would be people who are just total strangers. They have no interaction between them, no history of relationship, and maybe even they don't even have friends of friends in common. So they're very distant. Well, relational distance affects the handling of legal cases, and here the relevant theory is law varies directly with relational distance, meaning as distance increases, the quantity of law tends to increase. So in cases between people who are closer, you're less likely to get a call to the police or a lawsuit. You're less likely to get an arrest. You're less likely to get a conviction. You're less likely to get a severe punishment. In cases between people who are more distant, you're more likely to get a call to the police, a lawsuit, an arrest, a punishment, and so forth. So as distance increases, the likelihood of legal intervention increases, and the quantity of law likely to be applied against the defendant increases. And much like status relationships, we can see this operating through a variety of mechanisms. Sometimes it's a matter of intimates don't want to involve third parties, including legal officials, in their private affairs. Sometimes it's a matter of they're more forgiving towards someone close to them and unwilling to do things like press legal charges or file a lawsuit. On the other hand, sometimes the resistance comes from the legal officials. People might want the law to help them, help protect them against an abusive spouse or some other close offender, but the legal officials themselves tend to view it as a private matter, something they don't want to get involved in. They might be dismissive of something that would otherwise be classified as an assault and call it just a family disturbance. And like status relationships, we see these patterns persisting throughout the entire legal process. Cases against intimates are more likely to be dropped or dismissed, and if they do go forward, they tend to get more lenient sentences. One example of the effects of relational closeness on law comes from the study of rape and sexual assault. Just for example, there was a study by Linda Williams, when victims will report their rape to the police, and she compared cases where the relationship between the victim and the rapist was a stranger or acquaintance, and she found that the percentage of victims who reported in that case was higher than in cases where it was a friend or relative. And you've got other research showing that, you break this down even more finely. People call the cops on rapists who are acquaintances more than they call the cops on rapists who are friends or relatives or spouses. And they call the cops on rapists who are strangers more than they call them on rapists who are acquaintances. So as the distance between the victim and offender increases, the likelihood of calling the police increases. Looking at this from the other end, when a case has proceeded through the legal system, punishments vary with the intimacy of the parties. So we've seen several studies of homicide that talk about this and have this finding that people convicted of killing intimates tend to get less severe sentences than people convicted of killing strangers. So as the relational distance between victim and offender increases, the severity of the punishment increases. And the chapter by Mark Cooney on the relational dimension talks about a lot of examples of that. And one of them comes from his own study of homicides in the state of Virginia. And he found that cases between intimates were much more likely to get a lenient sentence, something between 5 and 19 years for the convicted killer, versus cases with strangers were more likely to get the most severe sentences, either life in prison or the death sentence. And people who killed intimates virtually never got life sentences or the death sentence. So a strong relationship there between relational distance and the quantity of law. In sociology of law, we talk about variation in the handling of legal cases, and this variation often is variation that goes against the norms of liberal jurisprudence. Liberal jurisprudence tells us that cases should be handled according to universal rules that apply equally regardless of who's involved in the case. And yet we know that reality deviates from this ideal, so people often view the stuff we study in sociology of law as a bad thing, as a deviation from moral and legal ideals. They call these patterns of variation discrimination and point out that they're a violation of the written rules. And so people complain about inequality before the law as something that contradicts modern ideals that law should be universally and equally applied. People usually think about this, though, in terms of inequality of status, which is something that easily comes to mind when you think about discrimination in law. But the relational distance principle shows us that variation in the handling of legal cases isn't just driven by patterns of inequality, patterns of status difference. Your case will get handled differently depending on whether you're complaining about an intimate or a stranger, depending on whether you were victimized by an acquaintance or someone close to you or someone very distant from you. So what we might think of as legal discrimination or inequality before the law is not just a matter of inequality of status, it's also a matter of other factors that shape the handling of legal cases. And so you'll get patterns like spousal rape being handled less severely than stranger rape, or assaults between acquaintances being handled less severely than assaults between strangers. And so this suggests that if we are concerned with universalism, if we do pursue this ideal and want cases to be handled the same regardless of the social characteristics of everybody involved, we should also be concerned with differentials that arise from relational distance as well as those that arise from inequality of status.